Okay, I think we're going to get started. Good evening, everyone, if you're joining us from New York. Good morning if you are in Jakarta, like our speaker, Evan Laksamana today, and joining us from Asia. My name is Anne-Marie Murphy, and on behalf of the Weatherhead East Asian Institute of Columbia, the Center for Foreign Policy Studies at Seton Hall, and the New York Southeast Asian Network, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on Indonesian foreign policy towards the United States. This evening's talk is part of a 7-week series entitled Southeast Asia Views America, Perceptions, Policies, and Prospects, which aims to assess the tenor of bilateral relations between the United States and key Southeast Asian countries at the start of the Biden administration. President Biden, as you all know, has claimed that the United States is back. And in contrast to his predecessor's unilateral and transactional America First policy, President Biden has sought to reassure Southeast Asian leaders of the U.S. commitment to multilateralism and renewed engagement with U.S. allies and partners like Indonesia. At the same time, however, strategic competition with China is a defining feature of Biden's foreign policy, as we all saw at the Alaska summit, and this has led many Southeast analysts to fear that the new administration will view Southeast Asia largely through the lens of Sino-US rivalry and continue to pressure regional states to choose sides. This conference series, therefore, features top Southeast Asian experts from 7 different countries and seeks to explore the Southeast Asian perspective on the opportunities and challenges for bilateral relations as the Biden administration begins its effort to engage regional allies and partners. Indonesia, of course, is one of the regional countries the Biden administration would most like to strengthen ties with. It's the world's 4th largest state and Southeast Asia's largest country. It's the world's 3rd largest democracy and leader of ASEAN. And it's an archipelago stretching 3,000 miles over some of the world's most strategic sea lanes of communication. And to help us understand how Southeast Asia views the United States and what prospects for the relationship might be over the next 4 years, we're extremely fortunate to have 2 of the leading experts in the field with us tonight. Our main presenter will be Evan Laksamana. Dr. Laksamana is a senior researcher at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Jakarta. He's one of the country's top authorities on Indonesian defense and foreign policy. And as a political scientist, he's held research and visiting positions with the National Bureau of Asian Research, the University of Sydney, the Lowy Institute for International Policy, and the German Marshall Fund of the United States. And as discussant this evening, we have Dr. Donald Emerson. Dr. Emerson heads the Southeast Asia program at the Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center at Stanford University. He's one of the leading American scholars of Indonesia and editor of this new book, The Deer and the Dragon, Southeast Asia and China in the 21st Century. What we're going to do today is have Dr. Laksamana make his presentation. It's entitled The Last Line of Defense, US-Indonesian Defense Relations and Strategic Competition in the Asia Pacific. After that, Don Emerson will make some comments, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So the Q&A function is open. Please put your questions in. And without further ado, Evan, take it away, please.
Thank you, Anne-Marie, for that kind introduction. Good morning, everyone from Jakarta. I know it's late there in the US mostly, but here it's about 7 a.m. in the morning in Jakarta. Let me do the screen sharing for a bit. Okay, so this morning I'll be speaking about the broader US-Indonesia defense relations and how it might shape the Indo-Pacific. This is based on a paper that we're developing for Anne-Marie and the team about the US relationship with Southeast Asia in general. So I'll try to be a bit quick about the key points of the paper in this current presentation, bearing in mind that this is an ongoing progress paper. It's not completed. So if I'm a bit incoherent at times or that some parts of the key chapters are still missing bits and pieces of information. I apologize, but hopefully I can get some of the key points across, and hopefully to get feedback from Don as well as from the audience. So I'd like to make three key points about the key paper here. Is first of all, there is a perception in the US-Indonesia relations that right now, yes, it is true that China is probably leading in terms of economic relationship, social interactions, even party-to-party interactions with Indonesia. But as long as the security or defense relationship between US and Indonesia remains solid, particularly on the defense side, that should be sufficient. That eventually from that a defense relationship, the US can sway Indonesia away from China in its competition in the Indo-Pacific. I'd like to argue that that's not the case. Historically, theoretically, and in terms of contemporary policy challenges, I'd like to argue that the military-to-military ties is actually not sufficient, and I'll explain that later on. Secondly, one of the reasons why that's not sufficient is because when we look at how Indonesia formulates grand strategy, that idea that the military-to-military ties is enough is probably more rooted in historical perception, because in the past, during the Cold War, that's how the US saved its relationship with Indonesia through the military-to-military ties, and then turned the tide against communism in the 60s. But today, I'd like to argue that the military is no longer the dominant player in how Indonesia formulates its grand strategy. So therefore, different elites, whether it's military, political, or business, have different issue areas of influence. So relying on the military alone, like the US did during the Cold War, is no longer appropriate and sufficient. And lastly, in terms of the broader US-China competition, we are at a point as such in the triangular relationship between Indonesia and China that, yes, it is probably true that given its geostrategic location, Indonesia may be the fulcrum that can tilt the balance of US-China competition in the region. But from the perspective of the elites here in Jakarta, it's probably still about functional differentiation, that the US can still provide some security goods, and then China will provide non-security goods. But those two things are not necessarily correlated with one another, and it is, I think, a fool's errand to accept or to expect a strong military-to-military ties alone can sway Indonesia in the competition between US and China. So just very briefly in the chapter, I'll explain this a bit more detailed, but the idea, as I said earlier, historically, that it is the president, the military, and the foreign ministry that handles grand strategy, but that's no longer the case. That right now we have moved from a tripartite veto structure into much more fragmented authority structure. Just on the issue of China, for example, or the maritime domain, there are many stakeholders that are equally strong in shaping Indonesia's policy, and that the military is only one out of many potential elites shaping that grand strategy. So the idea of talking about grand strategy at the beginning of the chapter is to show that in terms of grand strategy itself, I define it not necessarily in terms of external goals, but in terms of the integration and coordination of different tools. So the grand part of grand strategy isn't in the goals, but it's in the policy formulation. Why does this matter? Because the idea is that understanding how Indonesia historically have formulated grand strategy and how it does it today, it should tell us that building ties with one group of domestic actors like the military was necessary and sufficient, but now it's just necessary but not sufficient. This helps us contextualize, I think, the broader US-Indonesia bilateral and military ties, and it provides some analytical benchmark to guide the analysis of the chapter throughout. So historically, again, while it is true that the defense ties provide a linchpin that sort of saved US strategy in Southeast Asia in the 60s during the Cold War, when we look at the overall formal relationship, it's actually much broader than defense and security. People-to-people ties in particular, I think, have been kind of overlooked in the whole equation. But throughout the last 50, 60 years, people-to-people ties, economic ties, as well as others are actually a much broader underpinning of US-Indonesia relations. But the problem is, of course, that even though the military-to-military ties was a linchpin, historically, when it comes to actually the domestic politics sides of the US, the human rights record is actually also the one issue that keeps cropping up. In fact, historically, in terms of resolutions and bills introduced to the House and Senate, quite a lot of it is actually on human rights. So it's, in a way, it's paradoxical, right? You build your relationship on the supposed strong ties of the military, but on the other hand, the other side of the arm also criticized for that specific ties, particularly with regards to human rights. So from the get-go, I think historically, an over-reliance on defense and security alone has always been quite problematic, especially in terms of US domestic politics. And I think that creates an enduring set of challenges and perception. And in fact, just after the election of Biden late last year, the mood in Indonesia, sure, some of them are happy that we are no longer in the Trump era, but the other half was also concerned because they felt that historically democratic administrations will be very much focusing on human rights. And of course, we have our own problems in Papua. So that perception of human rights as a tool to poke and prod in Indonesia, I think, stems from this this paradoxical linchpin of relying on the military-to-military ties. Now, in the paper, I'll obviously speak a bit more and I'll put more data into this section. But the idea is that if you look at the post-Cold War era, before the 2015 strategic partnership between US and Indonesia, the nature of the relationship was transactional, at least in terms of post 9/11, for example. So if in the Clinton era, there's a concern about human rights, sanctions, and embargo, with the second Bush era and Obama, it's about restoring that relationship on the defense side because of counterterrorism, and then later because of China. But there is a strong transactional nature behind, I think, that contemporary pattern. And then under Trump, even though we have a strategic partnership, we never actually used it during Trump. It's there just in the background, but in high-level visits from the US under Trump to Indonesia and vice versa, we always talk about transactional stuff, whether it's about counterterrorism, whether it's about China or maritime security, and we ignore the broader foundation, which is the strategic partnership. So what happens now after Trump? I think from our side, the foreign ministry has started to use again that language of strategic partnership, but that was very much in the beginning. But the fact of the matter is, Jokowi in his second term remains transaction heavy. He himself only cares about a very small number of things in terms of the economy, in terms of infrastructure and investment. It's really hard to convince him about the broader strategic picture or geopolitics. So that, I think, has not changed. And then the breakthrough that many have called it as such, when our defense minister Prabowo actually walked the steps of the Pentagon last year, I think created this sense of euphoria that now we can go back to the defense side of things, despite the human rights challenges I mentioned earlier. But the problem is Prabowo's policy on the defense side has only three priorities: procurement, procurement, and procurement. There is no wider strategic plan. There is no long-term grand design about improving doctrine, organization, personnel, or even a long-term strategic assessment. So from that standpoint, yes, the language of strategic partnership is back, but the mechanism in which this is trying to be translated, I think, remains transaction heavy. And of course, the fact that Biden himself, I think, remains heavy on the US-China strategic competition, that means this is where the procurement thing will entice, hopefully will entice Prabowo and the rest of the Indonesian defense establishment back to the US. And I think we can talk more about this later on the Prabowo side. But again, The point being that despite the strategic partnership document in place, we are unfortunately still at the transaction heavy part of the relationship. And now, what does this mean in terms of the broader US-China strategic competition? In the paper, I'll explain a bit in more detail, but historically, Indonesia's relationship with the US and China is characterized by what I call pragmatic equidistance, that you build cooperation with both powers as expansive as possible, but also making sure that you're not too close with one over at the expense of the other. But in reality, I think in the past 5-6 years, despite all the rhetoric about free and active foreign policy, etc., the fact of the matter is vulnerability and dependence is certainly tilting one way, to China. And this is hammered home by the COVID-19 pandemic. Our medical supplies, vaccine research, health supplies, and even our own economic recovery is very much dependent on China. Whether we like it or not, whether consciously or not, a lot of our recovery and pandemic plans depends on our relationship with China, much more than our relationship with the US. So the idea that a commitment to 1 billion vaccines by the Quad is supposed to reverse this trend is hubris. It's not going to happen overnight. The US was missing in the early days of the pandemic, and that's a rhetoric and a narrative that's not going to be easily changed. But the point is that, yes, at this point, Indonesia is still very much tilting towards China, whether we like it or not. And over time, we try to justify it by thinking that this is normal, that this is just a matter of functional differentiation, that the US provides security goods. And that's certainly the case with now the defense elite under Prabowo, very much in favor of Western arms compared to Chinese arms, or even Russian for that matter. And China provides the economic side of things. And then hopefully there is a sense of optimism from the US side that that relationship on the military side can build into other stuff, can sway the broader elite. But I think that's a misunderstanding of how Indonesian foreign policy today works and how the current elite now thinks. And if you look at the actual pattern, comparing side by side in terms of US and China relations, it's clear that it's still far from where the US has built over the last 60 years or so. But also, of course, bearing in mind that Indonesia and China only restarted diplomatic relations in the past 20 years or so, in the 90s. So for about almost 3 decades, we didn't really have diplomatic ties with China. But in the short span of time, in the last 20 years or so, the relationship with China has grown exponentially and quite expansive. The defense side, I think the US will always win out. There is no way that China can replace the US in terms of the security ties. From a hardware standpoint, we're not interested because, yes, we say we wanted to build a defense industrial collaboration, but every time we foot the bill, they're not interested. The quality of the weaponry itself remains in question. We had a couple of them being installed in our platform. We're not particularly happy, but it's there. In terms of education and training, China is very, very low in the list of priorities compared to US, Australia, and even regional countries. On average, I want to say US and Australia, let's say out of 100 mid-rank or high-ranking officers being sent for education and training, about 50 to 60 goes to US and Australia. China is probably closer between 5 to 10 at any given year at best. And even that remains inconsistent. Exercises between us and the US and engagement is about more than 100 a year. With China is very small, about 5 or 6. And even then it's being on hold because of what's happening in the Natuna. So from a timeline perspective, since the last 20 years, China is certainly very much in the lead on the non-defense side of things, particularly on the econ side of things. The issue area is also very clearly divided from the defense and the non-defense side of things. But again, in terms of the overall grand strategy, it remains unclear how that manifests in terms of how we set our priorities. So to conclude, what does this all mean for how we understand US-Indonesia relations? Yes, the US remains central in Indonesian grand strategy, particularly because of that military ties, but the US is no longer the exclusive or the primary actor across the board. So it's only one out of several, and it's much more limited in defense sphere and not others. On the military side, the Indonesian military itself remains central in how Indonesia shaped grand strategy. But again, the military is also not the primary actor across all cases. In the maritime domain, in fact, the military is actually secondary to the Coast Guard and the Fisheries Ministry, for example. So we have to be clear that we need to know which issue area that we're talking about when we want to evaluate or assess to what extent US-Indonesia ties is expansive or good or bad. And of course, in the paper, I'll explain a bit more about kind of the more specific potentials and pitfalls of relying on those military to military ties. But as I've mentioned throughout the talk, it's great, it's necessary, it's solid, it won't be replaced, but we have to be clear in what we can expect it to do beyond the military side of things. For now, unfortunately, given the reality of the political situation in Indonesia, as well as in the US, at this point, a rhetorical return to the strategic partnership is welcome, but unfortunately, in terms of day-to-day engagement, it will still be transactional in nature. And when it comes to the broader Indo-Pacific, we've seen, for example, from the US side, with the Quad Summit and a much more sharper US-China competition, Indonesia is still very much insistent on its inclusive vision of the Indo-Pacific. Now, what does that mean? Right now, the Foreign Ministry is trying to develop strategies and resources to implement the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. But of course, all of that has gone out the window because of Myanmar in the last 3 months. So without ASEAN and Indonesia figuring out a way to address the issue of Myanmar, whatever vision that Indonesia prefers, because Indonesia relies exclusively on ASEAN for its Indo-Pacific vision, that means our plans for the Indo-Pacific will be put on hold until we can figure out a way for ASEAN to address Myanmar. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was extremely comprehensive and extremely depressing. But Don, I will let you take it away.
Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me. I appreciate it. This is going to be fun. It's good news that that Evan and I are good friends, very, very, very good friends. And I hope we will still be very, very, very good friends at the end of this webinar. But the role of a discussant is not to agree. Well, maybe that's a little harsh. To agree if the discussant thinks it is worth agreeing with. But I think the more interesting discussions take place when the discussant is willing to joust a little bit gently in a collegial manner by questioning some of the comments or inferences that would flow from, in this case, what Evan has just said. Evan knows me very well. This is exactly what he would have expected, and I want to live up to his expectations. So let me begin with the notion that the US-Indonesian relationship has, on the American side, been tilted in the favor of security, in favor of defense and military stuff. And it's a classic case. I think many people have noticed this, and that's not just true of Indonesia, but other Southeast Asian countries that tend to look to the United States for security, and they look to China for economic cooperation. In all honesty, as a tax-paying American citizen, it doesn't really please me all that much to think that I'm paying taxes in order to support Indonesia's security so that they can make money in China. I mean, that's just a kind of, I guess, a personal perspective. But the evidence that you've given, Evan, doesn't entirely, and I think probably because there's just more recent evidence that would, justify the focus that you give on the military. The slide that you showed about the number of documents. Now, of course, documents can be long, they can be short, they can be important, they can be irrelevant. I realize that. Over the long period of time of for all the way from 1960 to 2021, what's interesting about that slide, of course, is that the most frequent documents are not on security. They're people to people. In fact, if you go through them, people to people is the most, and actually economic documents surprisingly, in the context of an argument that emphasizes the military as far as US-Indonesian relations are concerned, economic documents are the second most common. And security only shows up in 5th place, right? Only a small number of documents. Now, I suppose the answer to my question is, Don, the slide includes the Cold War, right? Because it starts in 1960. And so my question to Evan, if you had a different slide that would concentrate only on the documents that have been signed between Indonesia and the United States compared with those signed between Indonesia and China, what would that actually look like? It does seem to me that the document undercuts the argument that you're trying to make, that the US-Indonesian relationship has in some sense been militarized. And the other general comment I want to make, I think it's very important for all of us to understand the words that were not spoken just now by Evan. Those words are global maritime fulcrum. Now, Evan, I don't want to get into a philosophical discussion about the meaning of strategy and versus grand strategy, but suffice it to say that that reference, dating all the way back to the first election that ended up vaulting Jokowi into presidential office, that was the one clear indication of, yes, a pretty grand strategy. If you claim to be, you know, the turnstile between the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, your critical position means that your field of strategic vision is broadened across 2 oceans. I mean, potentially you're trying to play a role way beyond the narrow confines of ASEAN, let alone the domestic confines of internal political economy inside Indonesia. And so I guess the first thing I would say is that it seems clear from what you say that Indonesia is moved to transactionalism away from strategic thinking. And the absence of any reference to that one highly strategic sort of pseudo doctrine that never really got explicated very adequately is further evidence of the abandonment of a strategic orientation on the part of a government run, after all, by a president, you know, who was a furniture salesman essentially in Solo and was primarily concerned with moving furniture. You can't put a bed or a couch on the back of a bike. And so how do you get it from Aceh all the way to East Java and vice versa? And so his perspectives from the standpoint of grand strategy are remarkably narrow. And they have to do with the Indonesian economy. And I'm not underestimating the importance of increasing the standard of living and the per capita income of Indonesia. That's a vital priority, don't misunderstand. But it does seem to me that, you know, it's not even appropriate to think that Indonesia has a strategy. As far as the military is concerned, as you know, there has been substantial criticism, part of which I think includes criticism from your good self, that the Indonesian military is not well suited to play any kind of strategic, you know, projecting role about Indonesia's position in Southeast Asia and in the larger world. I find it interesting that the South China Sea did not occur once, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe it did occur. I'm trying to remember in what you said. Certainly it was in no way featured in your remarks, and yet that would be one invitation for Indonesia to think strategically about what is, after all, the heartwater of Southeast Asia. And Indonesia is reputed to be the leading agent inside ASEAN, certainly the biggest, that can lead the regional association. And we'll see what happens in 3 days at the summit meeting in Jakarta, you know, when Min Aung Hlaing comes with blood on his hands, dripping from his hands, to sit down at the table and talk with other ASEAN members about the utterly disastrous situation in Myanmar. Doesn't that call for some kind of strategic thinking? It seems to me it certainly does. And Indonesia has developed a reputation for, as they say in English, punching below its weight. I don't like that because punching is a military act. You punch somebody in the nose, but you get the idea. Here's this huge country that in the history of ASEAN did play terrifically important roles, including the very role that it played in the genesis of ASEAN, in the birth of ASEAN. ASEAN probably certainly would not exist without Indonesia. And is that record simply to be left completely behind for a kind of narrow sort of day-to-day transactionalism? Well, I don't know, maybe, but if I were an Indonesian citizen, I would think there's a loss, there's a cost to abandon any kind of really basically strategic role. Now, a couple of other things, unless I get cut off, because I tend to talk longer than I should. Okay, if in fact, and I think you're right, Evan, the military relationship alone cannot sway, that's your term, cannot sway Indonesia against China and toward the US. Well, then the obvious question is, what, if anything, can? Now, one obvious answer from a Zopfan tradition, remember the zone of peace, freedom, and neutrality, which is still alive and well and living in the minds of a number of analysts in Southeast Asia, including some politicians. The answer was no, we cannot be swayed. We are the famous expression, right? We are navigating between two reefs. One reef is China, the other reef is the United States, and we must forever remain neutral. Neutrality is the name of the game, and don't think you can push us toward China. Well, it's interesting that the ISIS Yusuf Ishak survey, which I'm sure you've looked at, but now over 3 years, shows, in fact, when the question is asked to people like yourself, that is to say, individuals throughout the ASEAN area who are experts, who are academics, but also who may be in government, who may be policy people, business people, who in fact are really interested in foreign affairs and can influence foreign policy to some significant extent. Okay, so ISIS Yusuf Ishak asked them, all right, if you were forced to choose between the United States and China, which one would you choose? The answer is the United States. I'm sorry, I didn't make this up. Admittedly, the percentage in Indonesia that, if you will, voted to choose for the United States, if forced to, was lower, substantially lower than it was in some other countries in Southeast Asia. But nevertheless, to reject that option completely as being somehow, inappropriate or whatever, is to, it seems to me, to reduce the issue to an ideological commitment to neutrality, rather than to a pragmatic commitment that says, which side can help us more. Now, it's nice to be able to compartmentalize. The Americans take care of defense, as it were, and the Chinese take care of economy. But how long can that continue to last? When will China start? In fact, it has already started encroaching on the security realm. One of the questions in the chat already is, what would happen if China provided you the security? Would you like that? Would that improve your situation? And I'll stop there, and hopefully we can continue in a few minutes.
Well, that was certainly quite a bit. Evan, I have some comments as well, but Don obviously in his jousting gave you quite a bit of food for thought. And so I guess since you did title this, grand strategy, perhaps you could talk a little bit, whether you want to focus on the words not spoken of the global maritime fulcrum, or the broader issue that a commitment to equidistance might also mean a lack of a grand strategy, if by that we mean well-defined interests and a set of policies to achieve them. Do you kind of buy Don's implicit joust that Indonesia punches below its weight because it might not have as well-defined a strategy because of this commitment to equidistance? Or do you disagree completely?
Let me just say I've always enjoyed Don's comments. He's one of the few who gets me excited about comments, no matter how sharp it is. So I'm very excited. Let me address Don's comments first from the end, and then we'll get to your question as well, Anne-Marie, about grand strategy. In terms of the survey from ISIS, a lot of people focus on that question, but they ignore the first question. The first question in that survey is, what are your top 3 priorities of concern? And the answer is nothing to do with US and China. In the last one, the top 3 issues are COVID, economic recovery, and equality, not great power politics, not South China Sea. So by focusing on that one question alone about if you have to choose, if you have a gun into your head and you have to choose, fine, we have to choose the US. But do we want to choose? It's not in the question. We don't want to choose. No, because why? Because we have other things that we are more concerned about, none of which is about great power politics. So we need to look at the survey in its entirety rather than on that one question alone. And again, the survey is about regional perceptions of strategic challenges, not what the region thinks of US and China. So there is a wider set of questions that you have to take into account on that front. Secondly, I'm moving in terms of the order of the difficulties of addressing the question. Secondly, in terms of the defense and security tilt, that is precisely what I'm critiquing, that there is a myth, I think, at least from the policy literature, that the security relationship is essential to the broader relationship. A myth that I think started because of 65, that because of the relationship with the military, they saved the relationship and saved Indonesia from communism. But of course, as you pointed out, the documents actually show once the security side of things is addressed for much of the Cold War, other things actually came into play, the people-to-people ties, the economic relationship, and so forth. So yes, the idea or the argument that the defense relationship, the bilateral relationship is tilted on the military side is exactly the argument that I'm trying to critique as well, both historically and in terms of contemporary patterns. What the documents don't reveal, of course, is the fact that, number one, security documents are notoriously vague, right? The agreements that are more specific about exercises and training, about technological cooperation, are often not made public. So these are public documents, and it ranges from treaties to agreements to MOUs. So these are public in nature. So the sample that I presented may not be the full set of the population of the documents, but at least I think it captures the public side of things. And of course, you're right that the post-Cold War issue becomes a problem because the relationship in terms of formal documents, it's about how institutionalized it is. So some of these documents are mundane stuff like exchange of notes about currency, exchange of notes about defense training, etc. So the focus with the US, because of the timeline in which there is an uninterrupted diplomatic relationship as opposed to China, which was interrupted for more than 20 years, of course, it's different. The relationship between US and Indonesia is much more institutionalized because of the Cold War. So therefore, after the Cold War, you don't really need much in terms of new documents. The only thing that was different was because of the sanctions and the embargo after East Timor and all that. Then we needed new ways to rebuild that relationship, hence the strategic partnership. But the difference, I think, compared to China, because China didn't have anything in terms of bilateral ties for a long time, their main focus was to get the strategic partnership and then build from it. So a lot of the new institutionalized relationship with China comes out of the strategic partnership, especially on the economic side of things, people-to-people ties, trade, investment. So the logic is reversed. Because US had such much more developed relationship with Indonesia during the Cold War, it didn't feel it need to invest on building those until the strategic partnership. And after the strategic partnership, they do nothing. China is the reverse because they don't have anything before the strategic partnership. They focus on the strategic partnership to build the relationship further. And that I think is quite smart because you have the strategic partnership as your foundation, and that becomes easier to sell politically in both sides, in both domestic in China as well as domestic in Indonesia because of that strategic partnership. So the key is to build from strategic partnership, not before. And then lastly, and this ties into Anne-Marie's question about grand strategy, the biggest problem with Indonesia's idea of grand strategy is not in the goals. Because if Indonesia had grand strategic goals, then the idea is how to get at those goals. The problem is grand strategy for Indonesia has traditionally been interpreted about bureaucratic politics. How do we get the foreign ministry on board with the military? How do we get the military side to be on board with the Islamic political groups? Those are the nature about grand in Indonesian grand strategy, about the bringing together of different actors and different instruments. So therefore, the energy is spent on that and less on the goals. And this creates problems because, as you both pointed out, things like the Global Maritime Fulcrum may sound grand in its goals, but we were bogged down on the bureaucracy of things, on the implementation phase, right? Particularly because Jokowi, he didn't wake up every day thinking, how am I going to improve the maritime fulcrum every day, right? He issued it at the beginning and then let's move on. I have other things to worry about. So that means everything else is left to the individual bureaucracies. The same thing with defense policy, the same thing with foreign policy in general, and certainly the case with the doctrine itself. He wants to say something broad and then just not care about it on a daily basis. On a daily basis, that means the defense side of things, the foreign ministry side of things, they have to interpret and how to figure out how to formulate that vision. That's why you have conflicting visions, conflicting programs, conflicting arguments about the fulcrum, and why I think in the second term, the fulcrum is dead effectively. So the points about Myanmar, about ASEAN, South China Sea, I think I'll speak about this in the paper at the implication side of things, and not at the beginning. At the implication, what does this mean about the fragmented nature of grand strategy making? What does this mean about an over-reliance on the defense side of things? I hope in the analysis in the chapter, it will illuminate some broader points about Indonesia's foreign policy in general. And of course, I'll speak about the fulcrum. I'll speak about the South China Sea. So I'll make sure I'll note that in the chapter as well.
Okay, thank you. That was fantastic. So I guess, Evan, I want to ask you about one thing that could perhaps sway the relationship a little bit, perhaps moving away from the military strategic side to the economic side. As you mentioned, the top 3 questions and concerns in the state of Southeast Asia were COVID and economic recovery health concerns. And those were mirrored in Retno Marsudi's foreign policy priorities in her January 6th annual press statement, where she said promoting health security and boosting economic recovery were key. And so I agree with you clearly. The US was late to the game in terms of supporting Indonesia with regard to PPE, vaccines, et cetera, et cetera. But given that this is a long-term priority, is there scope in that issue area to help move the relationship? There's clearly a huge debate in the US now that we have had so much vaccine production. Where are we going to send it? How are we going to distribute it? There's a huge debate on that. Clearly, Indonesia could benefit significantly. And similarly, on the economic recovery issue, we have seen a lot of movement on the economic side with the US. We've seen the GSP preferences approved. We've seen a 750,000 Exim bank deal approved. We've seen a lot of movement on the US side. And we've also seen that Indonesia has a huge deficit with the United States. While it runs this, or excuse me, it has a huge surplus with the United States, runs a huge deficit with China. So in terms of sources of support for Indonesia's economic priority, it seems as if there is quite a bit of scope for the US. So I'm just curious how you view that aspect of the bilateral relationship.
Sorry, I forgot to address Dawn's question and your question about swaying. I think that's the wrong question to ask. First of all, I think the notion that Indonesia is surprised to be swayed one way or the other is what got us into this problem in the first place. That Indonesia is treated as a prize. On the one hand, geopolitically and geostrategically, as a matter of objective fact, sure, Indonesia is important, but this creates a problem for both sides. For Indonesia, it creates complacency. Oh, we're just going to sit and do nothing. We're important anyway. The US will need us anyway, so we don't need to put so much effort compared to other countries to contribute to US efforts or other countries' efforts. So that creates a problem for us. It creates a problem for the US side because it assumes that Indonesia can be swayed, and therefore the idea is to find ways to sway. My response to that is actually, to what extent should we find ways to make Indonesia much more strategically autonomous rather than how to sway Indonesia. In the effort of Indonesia being strategically autonomous, we might disagree more with the US, we might not. But that's the risk that we have to take if the relationship were to be put on an equal strategic footing that many of us have wanted for a long time. So the question is not how we can sway Indonesia, but the question is what kind of policies can create the conditions necessary for Indonesia to improve its strategic autonomy. And I think those are the areas that you start with, and then we get into your question of scope in terms of health, security, economic cooperation, and so forth. My sense is that those areas that you mentioned, the question is, are those areas that you pluck a hole and therefore you're chasing headlines, or is it based on the strategic partnership? If you look at the relationship with Indonesia and China, they're not chasing headlines. They're based on the strategic partnership. Occasionally, in crises like COVID, yes, then you chase headlines a bit. But the language, the mechanics, the framework is always tied back to the strategic partnership. So the key is, how do we figure out these areas in which US can contribute or can help or has room for collaboration, is tied back to the US-Indonesia strategic partnership framework. That's one. Number two, also be realistic in what the US can or cannot do. On the COVID side of things, which is a very limited aspect of health security, it's too late. Our deals with Chinese companies, both private and SOEs, in terms of COVID vaccine research, testing kits, and so forth, for the past year and a half has been exponential. So it's really hard to disrupt that. And why would we, right? If we're not sure, imagine if we, let's say, had made a deal to receive quad vaccines before the recent spike of cases in India. And then the whole thing collapsed now, and then we're stuck without any options, right? So we were actually very firm in that, in saying, yes, we would receive all the help we can get, but that doesn't mean we will replace or change our existing commitments. And our existing commitments mean about 80% of those commitments, medical supplies, vaccine research, are all with Chinese companies, not with US companies. So on COVID, I think US can contribute here and there. US can contribute in terms of long-term research, people-to-people ties in terms of education, scholarships, etc. But these are areas that are long-term, and in the short term, sure, there are areas in terms of health policy and cooperation that we can work with. But I'm not seeing it in a way to supplement, to overturn or supplant what we already have right now. So the US can be at best play a complementary role and a secondary role on some of these issue areas. On econ and investment, the issue is scale, right? The US pats itself in the back for an over time accumulative role, but ignore the last 10 years in terms of a wide range of issue areas on the econ side of things. And this is where it gets tricky. On some parts, you have to accept that by the nature of geography and economic complementarity, Indonesia will always be much more dependent on on China than the US. That's just a fact. Wasting time trying to overturn that trend is not going to work. And one of the things that I learned from looking at the defense relationship, the US had it right during the Cold War of playing the long game. It's low-key, institutionalized, gradual, not high profile, and make enduring ties. The Chinese now, it's all about big game, but short. High profile events, high profile visits, but it's not deep yet. It's not enduring yet. So the US has a lead on this kind of engagement that's more patient, that's more enduring, and more low key, and figuring out exactly what Indonesia needs rather than telling us what we need. So I think this is a key kind of a principle I think that we should bear in mind.
Okay. And I'm sorry, I'm just looking at some of the questions here. And I certainly think that many in the United States don't want to see this just in a zero-sum world, right? That the US is doing something just to counter China. And I used your word sway just because, you had used it in the beginning. But one of the questions in the chat relates to some of the public opinion polls and anti-Chinese sentiment in Indonesia and concerns regarding the overdependence on Chinese trade, investment, et cetera, and some of the negative consequences that appear to have come with it. The reliance on Chinese workers that is unpopular. Many cases, high-profile cases of somewhat shoddy construction with regard to electricity plants or overcost runs and delays with a number of projects. So public opinion polls and in the survey of Southeast Asia as well do show a concern with the rapid increase of Indonesian economic dependence on China. So again, not in terms of a zero sum, but it seems as if there is a sentiment that Indonesia would like to diversify away from China to reduce its vulnerability and dependence. And when I saw that Indonesia was starting a sovereign wealth fund and that China was conspicuously absent from it, much of the reporting was that this was a mechanism, again, to try to secure large amounts of capital without approaching China. So am I reading this all wrong? And obviously the US is not going to play a huge role in the sovereign wealth fund. So it's not about US and China. I'm just trying to understand that aspect of Indonesian grand strategy.
So this is a more difficult question because I think this speaks to a broader debate, I think, if not meta debate between what I consider to be, in the area of foreign policy at least, that there is no such thing as the elites always taking into account the public opinion. In terms of foreign policy, it's very much an elite affair. So on the Chinese side of things, I think this is also a much broader debate about the role of ethnic Chinese sentiments in Indonesia, right? And because of the undercurrents, because of the history, because of the myth created over the years, playing the anti-Chinese card is always the easiest card to play if you're an Indonesian political elite. Sometimes for good purposes in terms of getting economic goods, sometimes it's for bad purposes in terms of scoring political points against your opponents. So for me, I wouldn't take too much into account in terms of public opinion because public opinions don't shape foreign policy. Elites shape foreign policy and elites have their own interests. For example, I don't think that solving the Israeli-Palestinian issue is a strategic interest of Indonesia. But why does the Indonesian Foreign Ministry keep harping on the issue? Because it makes sense domestically. So it's not about a public opinion as much as it is about to what extent the elites of the day manipulates the issue about China, about their potential encroachment, whether it's about labor, it's about economic influence, etc. And despite all of this, to give one example, Golkar, a strongly anti-communist party for much of the Suharto era, and now among the top 3 largest party, and in fact, they supported ideas that are still seen as anti-communist, etc. Golkar actually has the most number of interactions with the CCP over the last 10 years compared to other parties. So the point being is that public opinion and elite interaction are two different things when it comes to foreign policy. And then thirdly, in terms of wanting to diversify, the idea of decoupling, strategic diversification, it's good rhetoric for the public, but it's not really easy to do in practical terms. Ask Japan, Australia, and India when they try to diversify away from China. It's not easy. They'd like to do it, but it's not easy. Secondly, our economic plans before and after COVID are widely different, I think. The focus, the available resources, the capacity to engage with certain policies, I think are also wildly different. I think right now, some may be issuing concerns about an over-reliance or an over-dependence on Chinese medical and economic supply chain, but we actually don't have a solution of what to do to actually move in that direction. I thought this voice will grow louder, but right now, in the last 5-6 months or so, I think the government just assumes COVID is over and we're back to doing business as usual. So I'm not sure what that entails now, but the point, I think, is that when it comes to ethnic Chinese sentiments, it will always be there, not necessarily because that the public is important, but because the elites will always find it easy to manipulate those sentiments.
Okay. We have a couple of questions. It's a bit off topic. One from Margaret Scott, another one from Richard Borosak regarding the upcoming ASEAN summit on Myanmar that Indonesia will host in a few days. I don't know, Evan, if you want to make a couple of comments about how it may unfold. Obviously, this is a high stakes situation for Indonesia and for Jokowi. And from the perspective of US-Indonesia relations, clearly one of the things that the Biden administration was hoping to do was to re-engage the region through ASEAN, and that's very hard to do at the moment. So if you would like to take a stab at those two related questions.
Sure. It's the flavor of the week, I guess. Let me first speak about the Myanmar first, and then the U.S. side of things. First of all, Indonesia is not the host. It is still Brunei is the chair that issues the invitation. It's organized at the ASEAN Secretariat, but the host is still Brunei as the chair, not Indonesia. We provide the venue. Just so happens ASEAN Secretariat is in Jakarta, but Indonesia is not hosting because the chair, I think, is still Brunei. Best case versus worst case scenario. Best case scenario is that there is a commitment to adopt an ASEAN-led framework to address the issue. Now, that commitment may entail subsequent meetings. It may entail creating a specific mandate. But if there is even a commitment to adopt an ASEAN-led framework, that creates a funneling of options, right? So therefore, we don't have to wait for UNSC to get its act together. We don't have to wait for external parties, that there is a platform in which we can hope to address the issue, and then we'll figure out the details further. Secondly, is that the proposal that Indonesia has been going around the region saying over the past month and a half or so is comprising of three things. One, there has to be an end of violence. We call it humanitarian pause, an ending of the violence by the military and the restart of public services. Only then can we provide humanitarian assistance through the ASEAN AHA Center. So the humanitarian assistance is conditional on the humanitarian pause being observed, and then we can deliver aid. And then hopefully these two things, the pause and the aid, creates the space necessary for an ASEAN facilitated but a Myanmar-led and a Myanmar-owned dialogue involving all the stakeholders. Now, The details obviously is very tricky than these principles I just said, and that's what's being negotiated, and to what extent we're going to see movements on these proposals, as well as the commitment for an ASEAN-led framework right now is a bit up in the air. The chances have declined significantly since the Thai Prime Minister Prayut is not coming. He would have been the one person that everybody would corral to lobby Min Aung for any kind of commitment. Without him around, I don't think it's easier said. It's going to be easy. Bearing in mind, of course, that the summit itself is going to be a 2-hour affair. They're going to come in the morning and then leave at night. So the negotiation happens before the summit, not at the summit. The summit is about views being expressed and commitments being endorsed, if there are any. So we'll see what happens in the next few days, but we should know more by Friday night at the working dinner of the foreign ministers before whether there is any kind of commitment. Worst case scenario, obviously, is to just everybody comes, everybody says their piece, and then we go our separate ways, and then that's it. That would be bad, because we already create so much criticism by inviting Min Aung to come. We have been criticized for saying that we confer legitimacy, although I want to make it clear, legitimacy is not for ASEAN to decide. It's only the people of Myanmar to decide. What we are doing is recognizing the existence of all parties. We have built communications with CRPH before, and now NUG. So we recognize the existence of all parties, and in this particular instance, the main and most important goal of the summit is to end violence. Who is doing the violence? It's only one side. It's the military. So we call the military so that we can get them to stop the violence. So that's where we are right now. U.S. overtures and U.S. role, it's a bit tricky, I think, because compared to Japan, India, Singapore, Thailand, Russia, China, the U.S. doesn't have as much leverage. And by leverage, I mean ties, relationship, investment, political security, or economic in Myanmar. Can the U.S. have leverage using sanctions? Sure, but historically that hasn't been the most important factor to get the generals in Myanmar to budge, right? So I think there are conversations now in the last few days because of NUG. And there are conversations to what extent Indonesia can recognize NUG, to what extent Indonesia can support the role of the UN in this effort, and maybe even thinking in terms of embargo or sanctions. But embargoes and sanctions are not the traditional tools of ASEAN, and certainly Indonesia. And in fact, Indonesia doesn't have much to do in terms of econ ties. I think something like 200 million worth of investment, which is nothing. We only also have like 300 people, 500 people there, so we don't have a lot of presence. I think right now, before the summit, the international community, including the US, is hoping that ASEAN can do something. If ASEAN can provide a foundation to build with, I think that's a good way to funnel support and progress and aid and all of that to ASEAN. But if the summit doesn't deliver, then we are confronted with a much more difficult question. Do we stick with ASEAN, hoping that ASEAN can deliver down the line? Or do we just move on from ASEAN and figure out a sort of concert or coalition of regional powers with leverage, plus the UN, plus Indonesia? Or we're thinking of linking ASEAN with the UN. There are maybe 4 or 5 different variations of non-ASEAN options that I think have been discussed in the region. It certainly has been discussed in Indonesia over the last few weeks, including unilateral steps, by the way, that individual countries can take, including Indonesia. But we don't want to, do all of these things or debate these things until we give, I think, the ASEAN summit its shot.
Well, I think all of us who've been watching the events in Myanmar unfold and the horrific violence are wishing you and everybody involved in Jakarta much success in those meetings. Evan, we had one question here from Wayne Forrest, the president of the American Indonesia Chamber of Commerce, who asks, would a Prabowo presidency maintain or alter the pragmatic equidistance with China? If so, how?
Let me preface by saying I personally think a Prabowo presidency would be a lot more problematic than the foreign policy side of things for Indonesian political system and democracy. So I think foreign policy issues would be number 10 in the list of things to be worried about with a Prabowo presidency. But if he were to win, and at this point, I'm afraid he is the leading contender in about a few years in 2024. If he wins, will he alter foreign policy fundamentally? I'm not sure, to be honest, because during the campaign, for example, he had spewed this anti-China rhetoric, and yet when he became defense minister, one of the earliest meetings he had was actually with the Chinese defense establishment. And in fact, during the early days of COVID, one of the first high-profile events that he attended was him welcoming Chinese aid at the airport. So I think Prabowo himself, when he came and spoke at CSIS February last year, so he came and he presented some of his ideas. My impression of that small meeting, he is actually very pragmatic about the world. A campaign rhetoric aside, political posturing aside, I think he's very pragmatic about the world. And I think in terms of defense ties, he will always be very much in favor of Western equipment. In terms of economic ties, I think he is also quite pragmatic enough to realize that China provides scale and a wide range of options that the West simply cannot. So I think he will probably be confronted with the same set of problems that Jokowi has. But I'm not sure Prabowo's priorities will be the same as Jokowi. Jokowi's priorities in terms of infrastructure, investments, natural resource extraction, etc., these are the kinds of issues that the Chinese might have an edge. What kind of policy programs that Prabowo favors may not favor Chinese edge, right? So if Prabowo, let's say hypothetically, focuses more on rebuilding agriculture, that's not really something that China can support, right? But the economic ties will remain, right? The vulnerability in medical supplies will remain. The trade part will remain, and how he handles these things, I think, will depend on his priorities. My sense of reading him as defense minister, he doesn't have an expansive vision yet. I think he has a very narrow set of vision that's kind of outdated. That's certainly the case on the defense side. I doubt that he will suddenly have a modern, expansive vision of running the country in about a few years. So rhetoric-wise, I think we'll see the same set of rhetoric as he did in the last 2-3 campaigns. And if he does win, I don't think foreign policy would be number one priority. I think it would still be number 5 or 10. So we'll see. But he himself, I think, is still pragmatic at this point.
Okay. Huge change in the last few years, huh? Evan, there is a question here about the North Natuna Sea from John Gould, and he's interested in your thoughts about how PRC activity in the North Natuna Sea will be managed by Jakarta and Beijing. Will there be future incidents? Will they thwart wider Indonesia Chinese collaboration, or is there some sort of pragmatic acceptance emerging? And does the North Natuna Sea insecurity help prospects for US-Indonesian security collaboration, or is that off limits?
So the problem with the North Natuna Sea is this is not a single actor issue. This is a multi-actor issue. The North Natuna Sea at least has about 3 different big issue areas. One is its relationship with the South China Sea, but these are separate. but it's still related to the South China Sea. Second is about maritime governance in general, which is more bureaucratic in nature. And third, this is about sovereignty issues, which are easily misrepresented and manipulated by the elites. On the foreign policy side of things, I think North Natuna Sea will remain off limits to ASEAN. And we want to separate the South China Sea issue from the North Natuna Sea issue. The South China Sea issue will always be addressed through ASEAN ways from Indonesia's perspective. And then for the North Natuna Sea, we will address it diplomatically. Now, the diplomatic ways to address this can be done bilaterally, obviously, as well as unilaterally. One of the ideas that we've been contemplating and we've been discussing at the track 2 level, in which we conveyed to track 1 as well over the last 2 years, is building stronger cooperation between Vietnam, Indonesia, and Malaysia. At the track 2 level, we even proposed the idea of a North Natuna Forum, in which we can find ways on the maritime domain to increase collaboration, coordination, and cooperation across the board, whether it's law enforcement, whether it's research, environmental protection, and so forth and so on. But this is all contingent on to what extent Indonesia can finalize its maritime delimitation talks with Vietnam and Malaysia. The sooner we finish those talks, the stronger our position is with China. The longer we delay the talks, the more likely China can wait and poke and prod as they see fit. So I think that's on the diplomatic side of things. On the maritime governance side of things, the problem is that the military is not the only actor. As I said earlier, the military is not even the most important actor in this side of things. The Coast Guard is a central feature in this, and they're trying to expand their resources and their size. So there's a bit of bureaucratic posturing happening, but right now the commitment is to have the Coast Guard kind of the lead coordinator for maritime security governance in the North Natuna Sea. The term that they use is class captain, because there are multiple actors. Right now, the commandeering captain would be the Coast Guard. Occasionally, when, depending on the nature of the threat, if it's necessary to bring in the Navy, we'll bring in the Navy. But right now, it's the Coast Guard, and the Fisheries Ministry is also right now still a key factor. There are some setbacks when the minister was arrested for corruption after flying back from Hawaii on a Black Friday shopping, which is always a mistake since I used to live in Hawaii. But you know, they came anyway and arrested him. But the Fisheries Ministry, the Coast Guard, and the Navy is a key feature of the maritime governance. Now, because of these threats in terms of domestic politics, it becomes presented as a sovereignty issue, when it's clear North Natuna Sea is not about sovereignty. The exclusive economic zones is about sovereign rights. And even this distinction between sovereign rights and sovereignty are not well shared across the political spectrum. So the understanding of UNCLOS is not unified or common across Indonesian political elites or even policymakers. Even sometimes the foreign ministry disagrees with the fisheries ministry about fishery zones and how that relates to UNCLOS. Now, because of the fact that this is presented as a sovereignty issue, it allows the military to push pre-existing plans for modernization. It allows them to push pre-existing plans for organizational expansion. Some of these expansions are certainly justified in the name of the threat in the South China Sea, whether it's a new submarine base, a new naval base, a new unified combatant command, and so forth. That is certainly the justification. But we are definitely not going tit for tat with China on the military side of things. That's just not realistic. And the problem with these plans that the military has, not all of them is about China as well. Expanding the organization and building new bases is also about jobs, something that the military currently struggles with. So there's a multitude of reasons to explain the militarization, if you will, of the North Natuna Sea, and not all of them can be attributed to China.
Okay. I wasn't going to ask this question, but since somebody else got us on the North Natuna Sea, Evan, can you help me understand why, for example, in her recent meeting with the Chinese foreign minister in Jakarta, Foreign Minister Marsudi didn't raise the issue of the Chinese surveillance ship that didn't have its responder on in Indonesian waters, and the discovery of those two drones, the surveillance drones that were discovered, a number of them in different parts of Indonesia. Yes, I know that not all of them can be attributed to one country, but certainly one drone did have simplified Chinese characters on it. Why do these issues not get raised? Is it deference? Is it other things? I know she had to raise the issue of, Chinese, or excuse me, Indonesian workers being, tortured and ill-treated on Chinese boats. Is there a limit to how many bad things you can raise in a meeting with the Chinese foreign minister? Any help in interpreting some of that would be greatly appreciated.
Sure. Sorry, I forgot to address the point about can the U.S. help Indonesia in this regard from the last question on the North Natuna Sea. If the problem in the North Natuna Sea is China poking at our exclusive economic zones, how do we get them to stop? Military to military deterrence isn't going to work because the problem is not military in nature. If we deploy all military assets, which we occasionally do for domestic purposes, China can present itself as the victim. Why is Indonesia deploying forces for civilian problems? So that's also problematic. So military to military sense of deterrence isn't going to be very useful. So how do we do this? The key is to get diplomatic commitment. The key is to get Indonesia to finally use its long-held social capital in Beijing to get them to stop. Jokowi calls Xi Jinping more than any foreign leader. We visited quite a lot. Luhut is the official liaison to China. We couldn't get them to have a commitment to stop. So I think the problem is diplomatic rather than military in nature. So in this sense, the US cannot really do anything. The US can improve Indonesia's maritime capacity, whether it's about training, whether it's about Coast Guard, whether it's about exercise ashore. But again, the US cannot actually really do anything to stop China from coming. In fact, if the US, let's say, were to deploy forces saying to help Indonesia, China might actually be much more angry to us, not to the US. So I'm not sure the US has a lot of options in that regards. On the issue of retinol, as far as I understood it, the issue of the surveillance ships and the drones, we've lodged protests before the meeting, I mean, that there were questions and protests being raised through official channels, both from the military side as well as from the diplomatic side. So expressions of concern, I think, have been conveyed in ways that are done at the track one level. So I'm not sure it was necessary. I think it was necessary to raise the issue publicly in that particular meeting. Is there a number of bad problems happening that will get us to say something? I hope so. I hope there's a certain limit in which enough is enough, and once in a while, to use Pak Hassan's term, megaphone diplomacy is necessary to call out bad behavior. And I think we've done this gradually. For example, in the past, we never publicly used the tribunal ruling of 2016 in our official notes or communications. We do now, for example. So gradually, I think steps are being taken to be more assertive in those issues. But again, going back to the earlier point, Indonesia's vulnerability now after COVID is much more complicated than before COVID, because it's now not just about trade and investment. Now it's about health and economic recovery. Two things that are central to Jokowi's legitimacy: the pandemic and economic recovery. And whether we like it or not, we are very much dependent on China. Now, does this mean China will explicitly use those vulnerability as a quid pro quo to pressure us? Not yet, at least not publicly, and certainly not that I know of. But somewhere down the line, it is in the minds of policymakers when we discuss difficult issues with China. So when our interests diverge and diverge to the point of being ruptured in public, then yeah, I think that's going to be the real test. Can we overcome those vulnerabilities and stand our ground? I'm not sure we're there yet.
Interesting. We only have a few minutes left. Evan, I was wondering if you had any other comments that you wanted to make on this. Don, if you had another comment or two, briefly.
Yeah, right. Well, okay. I don't have time. I don't have time to go into any details, so I will simply say that the issue of strategic autonomy implies that Indonesia would take into account which country, in this case, China, the US, is the threat to Indonesia's strategic autonomy. And insofar as Indonesia's neutrality is based on the assumption that the threat comes from both sides, that is simply empirically incorrect. The United States does not threaten the South China Sea. The United States is not going to occupy South China Sea. We're talking about geographic proximity, right? And so it seems to me that if Indonesia wants to develop a genuine strategy, earlier, Evan, you said that a strategy is not about a goal. Well, it is about a goal. If you don't have a goal, you don't have a strategy. If it's fragmented, you use the term fragmented, because it's hard to get things through the bureaucracy. That's a problem of means. But if there's no end that the means serve, then I'm sorry, it's not a strategy. And I will make a brief comment on Myanmar if I have time. Can you
30 seconds.
Well, that's really not enough. It seems to me that the issue of dealing with the unity government, the national unity government, is absolutely crucial. Ideally, they would have been invited together with the junta to attend the meeting coming up in a few days, although obviously the junta would not have attended. Now, I'm not saying that ASEAN should recognize the NUG, but I am saying that ASEAN should have contact with the NUG. If everything depends on the outcome of this thoroughly track one and therefore diplomatically focused and thus limited meeting, then essentially the emerging good news, quote unquote, will be, it looks as though maybe the junta will stop killing people. So isn't that a wonderful achievement? But of course, to some extent, that simply entrenches the military in the position that it has. And the Tatmadaw is not going to compromise on this issue. And therefore, I think if the compromise is one way, a gesture from ASEAN, it will actually help the regime to remain in power.
Okay. Evan, do you have anything else that you would like to leave those of us in the US with? Any hopes of what you would like to see from the Biden administration? Any comment on Don? You've got the last couple of minutes.
Sure, thank you. Let me respond to Don very quickly. First of all, I agree with you fully that without goals, we don't have a grand strategy. That's exactly the criticism I have as well for how the grand strategy is supposedly made, precisely because we spend too much time on the means and not enough on the goals. So our goals tend to be very vague and normative and less strategic and pointed. So I fully agree with you on that. The threat to autonomy is interesting because you use the term threat to autonomy, not threat to national interest or military threat in general. And on this issue, on practical terms, Don, the US is actually more intrusive because in every meeting, they would say stuff, hey, let's have a meeting about maritime security. What do you think about China? When China has a meeting with us, they don't talk about the US, they talk about us. So when you talk to policymakers, the intrusiveness to autonomy is more ever present and if not overbearing from the US side. In every track 1, track 2 meetings, that's what they want to talk about, China, China, China. That's intrusive to autonomy. So there's a distinction between threat to interest and threat to autonomy. And because you use threat to autonomy, actually the US is more intrusive. So lastly about Myanmar, there are contacts, Don. There have been contacts between regional states in ASEAN with non-Tatmadaw stakeholders. It used to be CRPH, now it's NUG. There are contacts. So to say that we don't have contacts is also not true. The issue of legitimacy, once again, is to be determined by the people of Myanmar, not us. But this is, I think, an issue that we have to revisit after the summit. Last words, I think, for the US side of things. Please get your domestic political stuff in order. Whether it's about COVID, whether it's about anti-Chinese or anti-Asian violence and racism, Indonesia is now much more aware of US domestic politics than before. So for the US to come pontificating about human rights or China now at a time when we are very much aware of what's going on in the US, it's a bit hard sell. So I think before the US gets some of its domestic political stuff in order, in both COVID and political and economy, we'll wait. We have been waiting for the Trump era to be over for a while now, so we're certainly much more excited to work with the Biden administration. But less pontificating and more figuring out shared interests, and not mentioning of China would be appreciated.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And as I said at the beginning, one of the reasons, the fundamental reason I organized this conference series was to try to get at the relationship from the Southeast Asian perspective, outside of the China attitude that does tend to prevail in Washington, and this tendency to only look at Southeast Asian countries and issues through that lens of Sino-US rivalry. So Evan, you have given us so much food for thought and so many different ways of looking at the intrusiveness and the way in which those things are perceived in Jakarta. So that has been extremely helpful to me. And I'm sure I speak for the entire audience when I say that. We are out of time. Before I thank our speakers, I just want to let everybody know that we will be convening at the same time next week, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, when we shift to Malaysia. Our speaker will be Dr. Chung Choi Kwik of the National University of Malaysia, and he'll give a talk entitled Ambiguities of Alignment, the Politics of Malaysia-US Relations, and we'll have some commentary from Melina Noor of the Asia Society Policy Institute, so it should be a great discussion. I'd like to thank Srinith Poole, the New York Southeast Asia Network Coordinator, who's been making this all possible from the technical side. I'd like to thank all of you for coming, but most importantly, I really want to thank Evan Lasksama for getting up early today, giving a fantastic presentation, and giving a lot of material for Don to joust. I always enjoy my conversations with both of these individuals, and it's even more fun when we can all get together. So thank all of you. Thank you, Evan. Thank you, Don. I hope to see you folks back on the screen, because it's going to be a while till we can all get together, and I hope to see many of you next week. Thank you very much.